How's it going, everybody? Welcome back to the channel, and today we're going to be taking a look at the Gamdias Argus M1. This is an ATX mid-tower that clocks in at about $70 MSRP, at least as far as I'm seeing online as of this filming. So the main selling point here is the addressable RGB functionality that's been built into the front panel. We have this strip that goes along this section of glass on the front, which I will touch on after I get some hardware in here. That is all addressable, and you can sync it with any of the major addressable RGB lighting ecosystems like Aorus, Mystic Light, RGB Fusion 2.0. We also have some addressable RGB surrounds along the front I/O up here, which in itself is actually okay. It's a single USB 3.0 port and two USB 2.0 ports, plus your obligatory headphone and microphone jacks, as well as a little button off to the side you can use to control the lighting in the event that you don't have a lighting sync system. I kind of like that. And then we've got your power and reset switches up at the top here, with the reset switch being noticeably difficult to depress accidentally. I kind of like that. We also have tempered glass along the side and a spacious enough interior to account for an e-atx motherboard being in this case. And then of course we've got your power supply basement with the two accommodations for 120mm fans along the top, and the ability to mount two 2.5-inch hard drives within the interior of the case towards the front where the fans would mount, two along the back in the cable management area, as well as a larger hard drive cage for two 3.5-inch hard drives along the bottom front of the case. It is repositionable and removable, and it has two simple yet effective plastic caddies to hold the drives in place. But the astute among you probably already noticed that this front panel is not particularly open. There's only a few slats along either side of the front panel to allow air to get through to those front fans. So we're going to put this case through its paces now. We're going to throw my personal computer in here, which consists of a Ryzen 7 3700X cooled by a Fuma 2, 32 gigs of G.SKill Trident Z DDR4, and a GTX 1080 Ti. And we're going to do some temperature testing, of course, and we'll come back and discuss my build process here and what I did like about the case versus some opportunities to improve upon this design further. So I've got some work ahead of me. Let's get to it. And there she is. The build is done in the Argus M1. So starting at the front panel, the first thing that I'm really not a fan of with this chassis, honestly, is this flat, completely unbreathable front panel. As I mentioned before, there's only these slots on either side of this front panel. They don't even go all the way up to the top. And you have this tempered glass panel here, which looks cool, and even their marketing material suggests that was the idea here, was to sort of create a sort of just a breakup of textures on the outside of the case, but you've sacrificed functional airflow on the altar of tempered glass and ARGB, and for me personally, that's not a compromise I personally would have made. Now, moving on to the lighting implementation here, this strip is the only one that will actually synchronize with your motherboard's ARGB control software. So in my case, RGB Fusion 2.0. You can still change the mode for your I/O lighting by using this button right here. As we can see, it'll cycle through a bunch of different modes. And what I thought was going to be a reset button up here is actually the button that changes the lighting mode for your lighting strip right here. So if you didn't have any addressable ARGB hardware in your computer, you can just press this button and it'll start cycling through the different available light modes that are pre-programmed into the front panel. I kind of like that that button is a bit more difficult to depress than the power button is over here. You're less likely to accidentally hit it, so that's not a bad implementation. What is bad about the front panel for me, however, is unfortunately, get this off, hold on a second. Oh, why is that so difficult? The main problem I have is the cabling is so damn short for the front I/O, and I can't really get a good enough shot to really illustrate it, but this is about as much as I can take the front panel off with all of the cables managed as comfortably as I can get them. So I can't really swing this out of the way without completely undoing all of my cable management on the inside of the case. Now, while we have the front panel off, we can see that there's no dust filter here. And unlike the build we recently wrapped up testing with, that's not by choice. This case actually doesn't come with front dust filtering, which, you know, I guess that makes up for a little bit for the lack of ventilation that exists in this front panel right here, but there were these grill-like inserts that were sitting in front of where the fans drew in air, and it sort of matched the mesh pattern that's on the roof of the case, but the thing is, that sheet metal was really, really thin. Like, I guess they were there to add structural integrity to the front of the case, but whether they were there or not, the sheet metal up front here is extremely thin. Yes, with the whole thing put together, it doesn't really amount to a whole lot of anything, but it is something worth mentioning, and it is admittedly a build quality concern. Next up with build quality is these mounts for the tempered glass side panels. This particular style of mount is basically just a sort of modified motherboard standoff with this rubber gasket on the outside of it, and as you can see right here, it's really easy to just unscrew this by hand. And in fact, what was happening was when I first got this case out and started building it, I was noticing that when I was taking out the thumb screws, these were coming out with it. If this happens to you, you can get these retightened over time to the point that it'll stop happening for you, but it's probably not a bad idea to get some thread lock and just apply a little bit to the threads on this thing before you screw it back into the case. That'll probably help it stay in place a lot better. Now what you see right here is what you get. It's as far as building materials are concerned for your build, it's just a baggie of screws. And these zip ties were just sort of everywhere on the interior of the case. I had to do a little bit of hunting for them, but they give you like 5 or 6 in total. It should be enough for you to comfortably manage all of your cables. But for fasteners, they only give you 2 of these long shank screws. And the problem with only giving you 2 of these is this is what you need to use to mount a fan to the top of the power supply shroud over here, because you can mount 220mm fans if you want to redirect some of this front intake charge straight up at your GPU fans. Problem is, with only having 2 of the required fasteners to do that, you can only realistically mount 1 fan with any confidence that you're going to be able to keep it in place. So I would like to see them not cheap the hell out on these fasteners in the future and supply us with, I don't know, 6 more. I do like the way the interior of the build cleans up for the most part. Yeah, it's a little tight up here in the back corner, and you're definitely not going to want to install a tower heat sink like this Fuma 2 here prior to doing all of your cable management back there. You're going to want to do this actually after you get the motherboard installed, but before you install your roof fans. That'll give you the best opportunity to make sure that all of your cables are cleanly managed back there, and that you can even reach the rear motherboard standoff in the back to finish securing the motherboard in place. Now along the front side over here is where you're supposed to be able to mount 2 solid state drives. I don't have any 2.5-inch SSDs or hard drives to mount in this build, therefore we can see all of the cable routing openings for supporting e-atx motherboards, which also means we can see any of the cables that have to get managed behind the case there. I'm not sure why they felt the need to tick that particular box with this case, because if I'm being perfectly honest with you, this is not the kind of case that I'm going to stuff an e-atx motherboard into any capacity, ever. So yeah, honestly, it would have made more sense to have these openings pushed closer to the front of the chassis to act as cable management holes for your fans up front. Because as it stands right now, I'm having to sort of route all of them directly underneath where the motherboard tray ends, and it's not as clean as it could be. So another bit of a missed opportunity there. I see why they did it, I just don't get why they did it. Also on the topic of build quality concerns is these PCI Express covers. These are the stupid punch-out covers, and they only supply you with 2 replacements. And you can see I have one mounted above and below the graphics card each, just to get more of these things out of the way. But this is just, this doesn't feel premium like this case was intended to feel with all the tempered glass and RGB lighting. This metal bends with very little effort, and this is the stuff that was This is very similar to the type of metal that was sitting in the front of the case where the front intake fans mount, only this is a bit more rigid because there's more actual metal here than there was in the stuff that I took out of the front. But even still, I obviously can't put this back in the case if I want to, so yeah, that's just, I don't understand why the corners that were cut there, but you know, it is what it is. Now for the roof of the chassis, we are able to accommodate two 120mm or two 140mm fans. The online user's guide specifies 320mm fans up here. That is straight up wrong. There is no way, with these fans already being as far back as I can set them, there is actually 0% chance of me fitting a third 120mm fan in the front without this mesh area being extended closer to the front of the case. Not only that, but one of the marketing images shows a very different looking interior than what we're seeing on this particular case. So if I were a consumer that purchased based off going to the Gamdias website and then bought this case and saw this interior instead, I might be a little confused and honestly a little concerned about what it is I just spent my money on. So I would definitely update the user's guide for this case as well as the marketing materials to accurately reflect the interior of the chassis and actual cooling accommodations. All right, so let's flip her around and talk cable management. All right, we got the case flipped around. Let's take the side panel off and reveal to you kind of sloppy cable management for me, if I'm being perfectly honest. This build isn't going to be in this form very long. I've got another case review coming up for you all pretty soon. But for a slapshod job, it's still not terrible, and I'm able to easily get the side panel back onto this case with no problem. One thing I will mention, I am using an Antec HCP 850 power supply. These are very long power supplies. So you would need to move the hard drive cage here to a full forward position, which unfortunately would restrict your use of all-in-one liquid coolers in the front to either a 240 or a 280 rad, because this will cut off accommodations for a radiator that extends further down than that. One thing that I did notice when removing the hard drive cage, though, was a bit of an inconsistency with the paint job on this case. A lot of the paint that was underneath the fasteners for this really easily flaked off. I haven't seen that anywhere else on the case, so I'm not entirely sure if that's just something that would happen anywhere that you used fasteners with knurled heads on them. Again, it's not particularly confidence-inspiring, especially when this case is brand new. So as far as cable management depth and other accommodations are concerned, there is plenty of room behind here to manage your cables. It may not necessarily be, you know, the most organized cable runs ever, but there is plenty of room for you to get large looms of cables like this set up behind the tray and still not have any difficulty with setting the side panel back on. What I really like that they did here, and this is admittedly something that I'd like to see more case vendors do, the cable tie points on the motherboard tray are actually these dome shapes that have 4 circles cut out into them, which means you can run cabling either horizontally or vertically, and you still have a way to tie the cables down at that same point while keeping exactly the run that you wanted to keep. It's true this doesn't really account for diagonal cable management runs. As you can see right here, there were definitely some diagonal runs in this build, but the point is this gives you more flexibility at each cable tie point. So again, I really like this accommodation. Now probably the only other thing that I wasn't a fan of was the length of the I/O cables for the front panel here. I mentioned this earlier, but the front I/O cables are short enough for like your power button and your hard drive activity lights and such. Those are short enough that once they're managed properly, I can't comfortably get this front panel off without undoing basically this entire loom of cables here. So I would definitely like to see at least another 2 inches worth of length on the front I/O cables, just to make sure that we have enough room to comfortably service this case because, again, there's no dust filter here, so we're gonna need to take this front panel off a little bit more often than normal if we want to keep this build nice and clean. Oh yeah, and there's a dust filter on the roof for those of you that are into that sort of thing. All right, so that's enough yammering about the build. Let's get into performance and conclusions. Let's talk thermal performance. Now, looking at the comparisons between the Argus M1 and Meshify S2 with my exact same hardware being in each case and as close to the same configuration as possible in each case, we can see that while CPU temperatures are more or less in line with one another, there's about a 2.5 degrees C difference or so, and that did result in the Argus not boosting quite as high on some of my cores and threads, but we're talking maybe 25 megahertz here. Where the big difference manifests is in GPU temperatures, where we're getting close to an 8C temperature difference between the Argus M1 and Meshify S2 in favor of the Meshify. To me, this is kind of an interesting result since the ventilation slots on the front panel seem to line up with case fans that would be aimed more directly at the graphics card. So it's clear that even that little bit of ventilation right there, seeming to prioritize GPU thermal performance, really isn't doing enough work in this scenario. Now, when I tested the Argus M1 again with no front panel, thanks to a little assist from my friend Stimpy, we see that actually thermal performance can theoretically be on par with a Meshify S2. This is a testament to two facts here. One, the Meshify S2 has a well-designed front panel. Two, the Argus M1's front panel definitely needs some revision work done to it, as we will discuss in the conclusion starting now. All right, so let's talk conclusions with the Argus M1 here. I think Gamdias could very easily use this case as an opportunity to learn a lot more about their product stack and how to effectively hit certain price points while ticking the right boxes with your product. Because there's a lot of things, admittedly, that the Argus M1 does well. It's got a clean enough tempered glass side panel, minimal tinting on this, if any at all. So you're gonna really clearly see the interiors of your builds, assuming you have any kind of LED lighting inside of it at all. The front LED implementation, there's going to be no accounting for personal taste on that, but I personally think it looks really good. The only issue that I really had with the front panel lighting was that you can't sync the front I/O lighting with whatever RGB ecosystem you're using. And when I attempted to synchronize the longer strip along the front, I noticed that there was pretty frequent flickering of the LEDs, and I was never really able to figure that one out. There may be some kind of screwiness going on with RGB Fusion 2.0 in my scenario, but I know it's not a limitation of LEDs to address per header because I've had way more LEDs than that on a single header on this motherboard and never encountered that flickering issue before. But on the subject of the front panel, I think there's an opportunity there to take that LED design and rather than implementing what was likely not an inexpensive piece of tempered glass to get mounted in the front here, instead mounting mesh where the glass is. That would give users the opportunity not only to actually allow the front panel of the case to breathe more adequately than it does right now, but that also gives you the opportunity to retain this front LED strip in the front if you wanted to, and you can still see the LEDs on your case fans in the process. And speaking of case fans, at $70 to $80 MSRP for this case, why doesn't this thing include case fans? I feel like there should have been at least one case fan in this case. Even if it was just some dinky little exhaust fan in the back, that would have been fine. But when you start needing to tack on, say, an extra $24 to $25 to get a couple of halfway decent fans for this case, now you're starting to reach into territory of cases where this thing really wasn't meant to compete. And even if you look at its existing price point, it's competing against the likes of the Phanteks P400A, which is a very storied and very well-regarded chassis in the sub $100 price point. I would also like to see the included hardware revamped a little bit, mostly in terms of that long shank mounting screw I discussed earlier that would allow us to properly mount two fans to the power supply shroud. If you have the accommodation in place and that's the kind of fastener that's required secure fans in place, give your customers enough fasteners to do it properly, or don't include the fasteners at all. Get rid of the fan mounting in the power supply shroud and just leave it open mesh. As well as shoring up the front of the case, I would also like to see these punch-out PCI expansion slot covers go away. That's an unfortunately cheap cost-cutting measure. And it's one that ultimately sort of wrecks the perception of quality with a case like this, which is kind of the point of applying tempered glass and addressable RGB lighting to a case in the first place, is having that high quality look, fit, and finish. So I guess all of this is to say that the core of the Gamdias Argus M1's issues stem from the fact that it's a victim of its intended price point versus the feature set that they wanted to make sure was getting ticked off here. We've sacrificed some build quality and performance for the sake of aesthetics, and that's never a compromise that you want to make as an enthusiast, especially not in a sub $100 price point, or honestly any price point. I am not going to want to sacrifice performance and practicality and build quality for the sake of aesthetics. That's never going to be a compromise that I would make, and I would expect that's not a compromise you should want to make either. Especially with something like GPU thermals. We've seen that this front panel is holding back GPU thermals by as much as 8C over what could potentially be with this case. And modern graphics cards are very dependent on their thermal environments for achieving those maximum boost clock frequencies that are going to directly impact your frames per second, your gaming performance. So at the end of the day, the Gamdias Argus M1 is enough of a mixed bag that I'm gonna say for right now, hold off on this chassis. I think they've done a lot of things well here, but there's enough that they can learn from and opportunities to improve upon this chassis that I would sooner wait for something like an Argus M2 to see where they improve upon this design. But sound off in the comments down below. Do you think I'm being a little too harsh on this chassis? I mean, yes, it is a little bit on the inexpensive side, but I don't know. Let me know what your thoughts on it are. Also, what do you think about that RGB implementation on the front panel? Do you think they could get away with just removing that tempered glass piece that you can't even see through and just setting some mesh in there and keeping that? How do you think that would look? And this is probably going to be the last video that I post for a week or so, because I am going to be at CES 2020 with Brian Stroh of BPS Customs. So I'm going to go ahead and throw a link down to his channel down in the video's description. Make sure you click on that and don't miss out on any of the content we're going to be bringing to you. It's going to be a very busy week, but there should be a lot of really juicy stuff for you all to check out. And as always, I'll catch you all next time. So take it easy.